We're very privileged to be here today in North Staffordshire to talk to Robert Copeland, whose family's had a long connection with the ceramics industry. So, welcome, Mr. Copeland, or Robert, if I may call you that, or perhaps I ought to call you Mr. Robert.
Well, I was called Mr. Robert on the factory because there were lots of Copelands on the management, and so they used to distinguish us by calling us by Mr. Robert, Mr. Ronald, Mr. Gresham, or whatever it was. So I've always been called Mr. Robert by a lot of the work people.
But your family has a very long connection with the ceramics industry, going back more than 2 centuries.
That is true, yes. My great-great-grandfather, William Copeland, was born in Lane End, that's Longton in these days. He went to London when he was about 19 years old, and he joined himself to Josiah Spode II, who had a shop in 4th Street, Cripplegate. And over the years, he built himself up until in 1805 he was taken as a partner to Josiah Spode II's son. And eventually, when he retired, Copeland managed the whole business right up until 1833, when his son bought the business. So we've had that long connection since 1784.
So although the factory was known as Spode until the Spode and Copeland period, in fact Copelands were connected with the company for a great deal longer than that.
They managed the London business. Josiah Spode and his son managed the Stoke-on-Trent business, and then after Spode II died in 1827, then William Copeland took over the management of the company as well, and then he died in 1825. So William Taylor Copeland, that's to say his son, who joined the partnership in London in 1824, he took over the business in 1833, and subsequently it became known as Copeland and Garrett, because there was no Spodes left in the business. And then in 1847, Garrett left the business, and so it was totally Copeland.
And W.T. Copeland was quite an eminent citizen.
W.T. Copeland was a Londoner, born and bred, and he was an alderman of the Bishopsgate ward, and in 1835 he was elected Lord Mayor of London, and so he was a very prominent merchant. He ran the company's business overseas as well, because a lot of the business was done from London overseas. Like, for example, in 1835, Copeland got a contract from the Hudson's Bay Company to supply wares for the Canadian market, and so he was very important, and he had business overseas, like Persia, for example. They did quite a big trade in Persia. At that time, the company in London was known as Spode and Copeland, whereas the business in Stoke-on-Trent became known as Copeland's.
So this was a very large business with international trade.
It did have a big international trade, yes, it did. Always has done. Something like 60 to 65% of its business was overseas, yes.
And related to the other factories in Stoke-on-Trent, would you say it was a large business compared to the other names we might be familiar with?
In these days, there are much larger factories like Wedgwood and Dolton, but we were of the same sort of size as Minton, Masons and so forth like that. So we were a good-sized, medium-sized business. We had something like 28 bottle ovens, so we were significant, and we had the site next to what became the town hall in Stoke-on-Trent. We had a very, very central site. It was 9 acres, right bang in the middle of the town.
So, in particular, some of the lines that were developed through the Spode and later the Copeland and Garrett and then the Copeland factories. Some of them were very significant in the history of ceramics.
Yes, Josiah Spode the First is credited with developing, not inventing, but just developing the process of transfer printing in blue, underglaze. Underglaze is the important thing because the printing in on glaze has been going on since 1760 or 1750s. But Copeland developed Spode developed the transfer printing process for underglaze blue. And that was quite difficult because printing on biscuit, that's to say the first fired clayware, was quite difficult because of the porous nature of the body. And I think that Spode's contribution was, in my view, was that he added soft soap and water to wetting the paper. It was known that wet paper printed easier than dry paper, so far as the pottery industry was concerned anyway. And he added the soft soap and water, which ended up by producing much more flexible paper for applying it to odd-shaped ceramic ware. It also made it easier to wash off after the printing process. I haven't developed the printing process in description, but that is a well-known process which enabled the good quality wares to be manufactured for the world's consumption.
Why do you think that underglaze blue transfer printed decoration became so popular? What do you think the demand stemmed from?
Blue and white enhances the appearance of food. First of all, there's no blue food, or at least there shouldn't be, and the appearance of food on blue and white is enhanced. Even a piece of white bread and butter is more attractive on a blue printed plate than it is on an ordinary plate. So it's also a relatively inexpensive process of decorating, and it is underglaze so that it was impervious to material, to oils and things like that, and it didn't wash off.
What kind of people were buying this pottery?
Now then, we were supplying all sorts of people, rich people, less rich people, middle class, I would say, probably mostly. But when you think of the exports to Canada, the Hudson's Bay Company, I mean, there were all sorts of people buying it there. They were traders, sometimes American Indians, or Canadian Indians, perhaps I should call them. And the trade was quite considerable.
Was blue particularly desirable before the development of underglaze blue transfer printing on earthenwares?
The Worcester factory was producing blue printed wares. Yes, cobalt blue has been a popular colour for pottery decoration for centuries, starting, I don't know, in the 9th century AD, or even perhaps earlier. The great thing about it is it would withstand a high temperature and fasten itself to the ware. So it appealed to people producing tin glazed earthenwares, ordinary earthenwares. It had a great longevity.
And would you say that it's been a staple of the factory ever since?
Yes, it's certainly Spode factory. It's transfer printed wares. We were leaders, and a lot depended on the quality of the engraving as well. So the standard, the technique of engraving improved enormously in the first 20 years after 1784, and they were able to distinguish between tone and tone by stipple punching, for example. There was line engraving and stipple punching, and the stipple punching enabled them to get different tonal qualities. It was interesting, actually, to show the difference between a line engraved background and a stipple punch background, and you can tell the difference, and it gives you a different tonal quality.
You would recognise, if you looked at a piece, exactly how the plate had been engraved?
Yes, pretty well. Although blue fluxes, so that at the high temperature at which it is fired, a lot of the individual dots are sometimes blurred to form a continuous tone of colour. So you can't always tell, but that's one of its charms, actually, of course.
And Spode went on to make a huge range of patterns with all kinds of different subject matter, for which they've since been very famous.
Yes, I think the background started because Josiah Spode II, that's the son of his father, he left the business in around about 1782, after his father took control of it. The background is that Josiah Spode I had worked for Turner and Banks, so we believe, in Stoke, and subsequently bought the business. But because of his arrangement with Thomas Mountford, I think it was Thomas Mountford, he had a deal which meant that he couldn't manufacture on his own. So until the arrangement had expired, he wasn't able to actually pot himself on the what became known as the Spode factory. And he acquired the business as an investment in 1776, but put his two sons, one was 19 and the other was 17, in control of the management. And of course they lived at home, and they would consult their father at night time to find out what they should be doing. And then after the expiry of the deal with Mountford, Josiah Spode I took over the running of the business in Stoke, and so his elder son was able to go to London and set up a retail business, which he did. He had to obtain a membership of a livery company in order to trade in London, and he became a member of the Spectacle Makers Company, which I think showed great vision. Then he opened his shop in 4 Street, Cripplegate, and I don't know exactly what he was selling apart from his father's goods, but I think he was probably selling other people's goods as well. But he became aware of the wares that had been imported from China, by the East India Company, and it was becoming increasingly difficult to obtain matchings or extra pieces from China, because the East India Company was gradually stopping importing porcelain because they were losing money on it. So I believe that Spode would take in Chinese pieces and offer to make replacements for them in earthenware, and he did very well. So we built up a series of designs which I call Chinese landscapes, based on the Chinese originals, but engraved on copper plates so that they could be reproduced, almost ad infinitum. And so he built up a trade in Chinese landscapes on earthenware, what we call pearlware these days, transfer printed in blue under the glaze.
And in addition to those Oriental designs, there are a number of more European patterns as well, for which the factory's become famous since.
Yes, most of the patterns that we are familiar with were recorded after 1800. The chap who produced the pattern books, he started the pattern books. He came to work for Spode, and he started the series of pattern books, which we date to about 1800, and continued right up until recently. Many of those patterns were hand decorated, hand painted on earthenware, and then around about 1799 or something like that, Josiah Spode the first. Just before then, he'd been working on developing a bone china body, which was a purer form of bone porcelain. And I think he is given the credit for the introduction of bone, but actually, of course, he didn't. It was introduced by Thomas Fry in 1744, but what he did do was eliminate the glass forming ingredients of the glaze and the pottery, so that it became a wholly raw material. They used something like 50% of bone ash, 25% of Cornish stone, which is a feldspathic stone, and 25% of Cornish china clay. And that was mainly the basis of the bone china formula. And that became very popular because it was much easier to fire. It fired straight, and he could use a standard earthenware oven, only just fire it about 100 degrees centigrade higher than earthenware. And eventually bone china evolved to the point where other manufacturers gave up porcelain and made bone china.
So bone china was another very important development made at the Spode factory.
It was very important indeed. When one thinks of the period in which Josiah Spode was developing his business, we're right in the middle of the Napoleonic Wars, and so they had Chinese porcelain to compete with, but the imports of Chinese porcelain were rather less, I think, and certainly there was practically no imports from Europe at that time. So the English manufacturers more or less had an open field to exploit.
Thinking about the technology in the ceramics industry and the implementation of steam, other industrial developments in the industry, and you've done quite a lot of work on the research of mechanisation in the industry, haven't you?
Just a little bit, yes. The introduction of the steam engine was very important because up until that time, of course, the operating of the wheels and so forth like that was done by hand, by somebody turning a wheel and operating the thrower's wheel. By employing a steam engine to provide power, this made it much more easy to develop more skills, more people. Businesses became bigger. The first steam engine, I think, that was employed in the pottery industry was actually on Spode's factory, but it wasn't an ordinary, straightforward steam engine. It was a beam engine, what we call a beam engine, which was actually a pumping engine, which pumped water to an overhead tank, from which the water flowed over a water wheel, and that was his first introduction in 1778. And in fact, it predated Josiah Wedgwood's Bolton and Watt steam engine, which he installed, I think, in about 1782. So Josiah Spode can claim to be the first person to produce a steam engine in the pottery industry. He adapted what was known as the Newcomen engine. A lot of the raw materials, like flint and Cornish stone and bone, were ground in mills outside the centre of Stoke, in the surrounding villages, where there was water supply, so that they were driven by water, and they continued to be used right up until into the 1960s. Actually, they were still grinding raw materials in the neighbourhood.
And you're particularly associated with Cheddleton Flint Mill.
Well, that's right. What happened was I was privileged to be given 3 years' work at Spode, learning the trade. So I spent a whole year making bone china platters by hand, another year making bone china plates by hand, and then a third year trying everything else. Well, now while I was working at the making of platters, it occurred to me that the skills that were being operated on the Spode factory at that time were still virtually the same as had been going on for the last couple of 100 years, and it would be nice to protect some of them for posterity. So I was talking with somebody at a lunch party about the idea, and it then occurred to me. I thought, oh yes, and of course we not only ought to preserve a pottery, but we should also preserve a flint mill, which is an integral part of some potteries, but some of the bigger potteries like Spode and Wedgwood had their own flint mill. Somebody said, oh yes, well there's one for sale. So I followed up this lead, and I got Rex Wales, who was an industrial archaeologist, and he came up to Stoke to have a look at it. And he said, oh no, that's far too big and far too recent. It's not nearly so interesting. The mill that you want to save is Cheddleton Flint Mill, which dates back to 1253. So, to cut a long story short, we acquired, when I say we, a small trust was formed to acquire the Cheddleton Flint Mill as a national monument. Now, while we were still in the throes of developing the mill as a tourist attraction, you might call it, as a monument, the Gladstone pottery came up for sale, and the city of Stoke-on-Trent decided that they would try and rescue a pottery. So they formed a small subcommittee, including Arnold Mountford, and we looked at 6 different pottery factories around the district, and the one that we chose to recommend was the Gladstone pottery. And the city of Stoke-on-Trent went into quite elaborate plans as to how to preserve it and acquire it. Well, then one day the owners decided that they were going to sell it and probably demolish it. So the Cheddleton Flint Mill Trust actually got together to see whether we couldn't preserve it. Well, we got some financial support promised, but what ended up was that Dalton's and H&R Johnson's put some money together and saved the Gladstone Pottery Museum, which is meant, of course, that it's safe for years. And I was intimately involved with that, and so it really came out of the thought that I had when I was actually working as a potter.
One of the most popular patterns, of course, is the willow pattern.
Indeed it is. It's the most popular pattern worldwide. It's been produced not only on pottery, of course, but it's been produced on everything. Tin plate, books, plastic mugs, everything. The reason is it's got a human interest to it. People are fascinated by the three socialists on the bridge, and of course a story was built up. This first story, I think, of it was written in 1849 in a magazine called the Penny Magazine, and the story of the willow pattern caught on. Everybody was fascinated by it, and it makes a talking point. I mean, if you've got a dinner party and you've got an interesting design on the tableware, it's got something to talk about. Willow pattern was created, I believe, on the Spode factory around about 1790, and developed from an earlier Chinese pattern called what we call Mandarin. It was produced by Carfley factory in Shropshire, but it was also produced by Spode because it was one of the matchings which he was asked to copy. And then somebody on the Spode factory decided to make it a bit more interesting by adding the bridge with the three people on it, and a pavilion to which they were going, and it gave rise to the story, the legend, which of course was created by this chap, which is unknown. We don't know who it was, but it appeared in this magazine in 2 sections. I was lucky enough to get a copy of the original book, actually, blue and white. Persisted for years and years and years. And it's persisted, and of course gradually as the technique for engraving and then transfer printing developed, so other designs were developed in all sorts of ways. I mean, the transfer printed business is enormous, and the two great societies that collected, like the Friends of Blue and the Transfer Printed Collectors Club, they've done an enormous amount to encourage people to take an interest in transfer printed wares. And of course it was not only blue, there's other colours, and this is where the Transfer Printed Collectors Club really score over the Friends of Blue, because the Friends of Blue don't touch coloured wares. And I don't actually think that there were so many coloured wares produced for the English market. I think they were more particularly for the United States market. Manufacturers looked to outside sources for their inspiration, and book illustrations for travel books and things like that were very, very popular, particularly because of the interest of the British Empire in India and China and places like that. There were lots of books written about different places in the Far East, and these subjects were used not only by Spode. Spode used the ones familiar with what we call the Indian sporting series, but there were masses of other subjects that were specialised by different manufacturers like Rogers and Riley and goodness knows what. I can't remember all the names, because it was a huge industry of blue and white, and a lot of coloured wares as well. But as I said, I think the coloured wares were mostly made for the export markets in North America.
I'd like to ask you about your association yourself with the company. You're obviously you worked on the factory at the sharp end, so to speak, but more recently you've been associated with the factory's historical advisor. And I do recall you enjoyed particularly taking people around to see the bottle ovens that were on site.
Yes, I was privileged to fire a bottle oven, actually, successfully, a biscuit bone china oven. I didn't do it for choice because the fireman was ill, And I went to the earthenware fireman and said, would you fire it? He said, well, I can't fire it, Robert. I've got 2 ovens to fire already, but I'll keep an eye on you. You do it. You've done it before. Well, I hadn't done it before, but I had, in fact, been round with the fireman, Jim Evans, and I'd taken copious notes as to what he did at each stage. I followed the whole of the firing with taking notes, so that it was a bit like a recipe. I was going round the pottery, I was going round the oven, looking at my notes. What do I do now? You know. But it was successful. It was a perfectly fired bottle oven, and people just couldn't understand how it was done, because you've got eight fire mouths, and you had to balance the heat from each one of these around the circular oven. You had to control the draft. It was a very, very highly skilled operation. Even though I said it, I did it. The fireman was doing it every week. And you judged the heat by looking through spy holes and things like that into the interior of the oven.
Was that the bottle oven that eventually was on site that rather came to a sticky end?
I was walking past it one day. We were going to preserve it. We were going to put steel bands round it to protect it, because it was built in 1789, so we believe, the actual hovel, not the kiln inside. The kiln inside was usually probably rebuilt every 40 years or so, but the hovel on the outside, which is the characteristic shape, was built in 1789, and we thought we would preserve it. And so we'd given instructions to a local firm to put iron bands round it, which was quite a common way of protecting it. And I was walking past it, talking with somebody, and it occurred to me that we were going to lunch, and it occurred to me that it had looked as if it was bulging a little bit. So we went to lunch, came back, and later on I was walking with the clay manager along on the grass, and I shouldn't have been walking on the grass because the managing director didn't approve of walking on grass. And I was walking on the grass, and the very fact that I was walking on the grass enabled me to hear a rumble of thunder. But it was a blue sky, and I thought, that's not thunder, that's the bottle oven. So I ran with my friend, ran away from the bottle oven, and the whole of the hovel collapsed just like a tree falling, just at the parallel route that I was taking. So fortunately no bricks fell off and hit me, but there was no puff of dust or anything. It was absolutely sodden with water. And so that was 1972, it fell down. And so we were left with just the kiln inside. And then the architect said that they should be pulled down because they're unsafe. So we've ended up with just the main foundations of the kiln. So there are not many kilns left. There are about, I think there's something like 30 or 40 left in the pottery industry, pottery district, but none of them can be fired again.
And what about the Spode factory site?
That is a problem, because the competition that we receive from overseas is so intense that we can't compete on price producing our fine quality wares. So we've been obliged to take the factory produce away, and so we've gone to places like China and India and Malaysia. What has happened to the Spode site, which is, as I said earlier, is 9 acres, right bang in the middle of the town, next to the town hall, and you can't imagine. I mean, I can't imagine any town in the world that's got an up and running factory of 9 acres site next to the city hall. You've usually got things like cinemas and libraries and things like that. The site has been offered for sale to a development company. We don't know what his plans are yet, but we believe that they will include a museum. We have a pottery museum, Spode museum on the site at the moment, but most of that stuff is being packed up because of the failure of the roof, which is leaking, and so we've had to pack up the display to preserve it. What's going to happen to it, we just don't know, because the developer hasn't made his plans clear, and because of what they call the credit crunch, we just wonder, in fact, whether the development of the site will proceed as swiftly as we had hoped. It may be that they'll pull out, so we just don't know. The whole thing is very fraught with uncertainty. It would be a shame, because the Spode Trust is a charitable trust. It has virtually no money of its own. It depends on goodwill from other people. The premises on which it was displayed would belong to Spode Limited, or the Spode Company, and they are strapped for cash as well, like a lot of manufacturers. I mean, we're not the only one by a long chalk. I mean, we're still surviving, whereas some of the factories have closed down. But change and decay, is all around we see, and we've just got to put up with doing the best we possibly can to preserve the collection as it is. It's a very, very good collection. I've had a lot to do with it. As you said, I was the advisor for 17 years, and I built up the collection, particularly of the 19th century, which the later 19th century, which was had been rather neglected by my uncle, who had formed the collection in the first place in 1925. So it's.
Well, I hope there will be a good future for the museum collection and possibly for
well,
the
we
site.
hope so. We need a site where it can go. We need a lot of money to provide the site. Even if the developer gives us a site, we're going to need money to produce display cases and things like that, and we don't know what space we're likely to get. So the whole thing is up in the air, as you might say.
Thank you very much for speaking to me this afternoon, Robert. It's been a great pleasure.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a privilege.